I want to talk about, I think I want to try to do something a little bit different. I think everybody here, does everybody here know that President Obama made a speech Wednesday night? Anybody doesn't know that? Raise your hand. Made a speech, and he talked about, what he really said was time for another war. And a war with really an open-ended war. A war that could go on for many years. And he didn't make any distinction about that. He said, yeah, it could go on for past my term, and everyone should be ready for this. And the question I'd actually like to try something different. I'd like to start by asking, what are the questions that people here have about what Obama said and what this means for the future for us? So I can go back to the talk that I was going to give, but I'd like that. Let's try that. Do people have thoughts about, questions about what's going on and what might be happening? Yeah, Ryan.
What do you think that his talk means in regards to Syrians?
There really are three major factors that brought about ISIS. And ISIS didn't exist until, really as an independent group, until I think it was late 2011 or early 2012. ISIS grew out of the Al-Qaeda in Iraq. And when the civil war broke out in Syria, the intervention, we believe, of the US, France, Britain, Turkey, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, really prolonged the war and opened the door for the AQI, Al-Qaeda in Iraq, to transition into another organization, which they then called ISIS, the Islamic State in Iraq and the Levant, or Al-Shams, meaning this whole region that's Lebanon, Syria, at one time included also Palestine, Jordan, and to take advantage of this opportunity, they changed the name, and then because this was a group that had almost become defunct. It had, by its own account, very few actions in 2010 and early 2011, and then had an opportunity to grow. It clearly is, now we see in retrospect, had absorbed other parts of the former state that had existed in Iraq. And the key point, really, in this whole development was the invasion of Iraq in 2003. And any people here ever see the movie Green Zone? Anybody ever see that movie? It's interesting because it goes to the point of this issue of very early in the occupation, when the U.S. decides to dismantle J. Paul Bremer, who was the first really ruler of Iraq after the occupation. They make a decision in the Pentagon, Rumsfeld, and conveyed through him to disband the Iraqi government and all of its ministries. Now that's something different. The ministries are like the cabinet positions here, except the cabinet departments don't mean much to us, right? I don't think much about, gee, what's the Department of Health and Human Services doing today, or the Department of Transportation. But in Iraq, it meant a great deal to people. It ran the health system in the country. There was a ministry for food and the distribution of food, and people were dependent on that because particularly Iraq had been under blockade and sanctions for 13 years. So there had to be food rationing in the country. All of this was dismantled. Everything was dismantled except the oil ministry. They kept the oil ministry. Or you wonder why, huh? And then a large part, they disbanded the army. And a large part of the army then went home with its weapons and without any future. And people began to fight back, and the resistance arose inside of Iraq, and the resistance that the U.S. leaders, in their arrogance, had predicted would be welcoming, the Iraqi population would be welcoming with flowers and chocolates and singing songs, and oh, we're so glad to see the Americans. Well, of course, that was just more of the mythology that was meant to sell the war to the people in the United States at the beginning. But the reality is that there was no Al-Qaeda presence in Iraq before the invasion and occupation. It did not exist there. It did not exist in Syria. It was the dismantling in their towering arrogance by the Americans of all the structures of government that opened the door for Al-Qaeda. And of course, many people fought who were patriots, Iraqi nationalists who were fighting against this occupation. That's where it came about. The Al-Qaeda element became very unpopular among its base, within its base, which was in the northern and western parts of Iraq in 2006, 2007, by trying to impose a very reactionary program on a society that had been a largely secular society. The U.S. was able to take advantage of that at the time of the surge. When it came, the U.S. put 100,000 Iraqi troops on its payroll. It was called the Sunni Awakening, or the Sons of Iraq, and Al-Qaeda was largely defeated. It was the civil war in Syria that allowed for the resurrection of Al-Qaeda in Iraq, which then morphed into the Islamic State, as it's called today, or as they call themselves today. So that was what was the most fundamental. And the fact that the government that the U.S. then created, and the U.S. policy was to promote sectarianism, to divide group against group, religious group against religious group, Kurds against Arabs, and to favor certain groups in the population against others, and to create the government that became the Nouri al-Maliki government based in Baghdad, and its army, which was largely an army drawn from one part of the population, and which suppressed and repressed and carried out many of the same kind of atrocities that we hear about that ISIS has carried out. This group was also carrying out, the Iraqi National Army and the militias that were allied with it against the population in the north and the west of Iraq. So when ISIS gained strength inside of Syria, which is where they gained strength, and where they were able to obtain arms and money and grow, that when they came into Iraq 3 months ago, a large part of the population welcomed them because of the repressive character of the government that the U.S. had favored, had funded, had set up. And the army that they had created largely collapsed, at least in a very wide swath of the country, which is not untypical of puppet armies that are created by occupiers. We could remember that in 1975, the South Vietnamese army was considered, I think, on paper, the 5th most powerful army in the world. That was on January 1st, 1975. On April 30th, 1975, it no longer existed. When the Vietnamese, the National Liberation Front, and the Vietnamese army, North Vietnamese army, launched its offensive, it completely collapsed altogether. So that's not a new thing. Also, the United States not only dismantled the government in Iraq, in 2011, it intervened to dismantle the government and state in Libya. So we have that same pattern that's happening, so that today Libya is a destroyed country. It's not really right to call it a failed state, because that is a sort of passive term, right? Like somebody failed, you know. Well, it's not just some passive failure. It was the intervention of NATO that allowed the rebellion to continue. The rebellion, there was a real rebellion in Libya. There were different factions in the population. But that rebellion could not have continued except that on March 19th, 2011, the exact 8th anniversary of the invasion of Iraq, the NATO bombing began. And in fact, the country was shattered by that. And the Islamic State, the ISIS, or whatever name we want to use to refer to them, in the offensive that they launched in June, were able, in the northern part of Iraq, to capture not only vast quantities of U.S. weaponry, and they've also acquired a lot of weaponry that the Syrian government had too, in the eastern part of Syria, but also huge amounts of money in the form of gold, oil fields that they're using to sell oil, taxes that they've imposed upon the population, and also the support that they've received, particularly from Turkey and particularly Saudi Arabia and Qatar. But now there are people who are saying, well, if you just cut off the funding from Qatar and Saudi Arabia, that would be the end. I don't think so. I think things have gone beyond that point now, with the ISIS. It's an extremely reactionary movement with extremely reactionary and often really criminal approaches to the population, where it considers that not everyone who doesn't believe in their form of Islam, the men can be killed and the women can be raped or sold into a bondage and so forth. So you have this extraordinarily reactionary group that arose in a parallel way to how the Taliban arose in Afghanistan, and how Al-Qaeda itself came into being. If we take a step back in history, that the U.S. intervened against a progressive revolution in Afghanistan, which took place in 1978. The U.S. intervened in 1979 before the Soviet intervention in Afghanistan, several months before, with the idea of trying to provoke the Soviet Union. This is a country right on its border, that a crisis there would provoke a Soviet intervention. The National Security Advisor of the United States said many years later, actually in 1998, 19 years later, Zbigniew Brzezinski said, we did this. We wanted to give the Soviet Union their quote-unquote Vietnam. And the reporter for the newspaper who conducted this interview, the A.N.S.W.E.R in France, which I'm not probably pronouncing correctly, but that newspaper, they said to him, well, aren't you upset about what's happened now with Al-Qaeda and this? And he said, we brought down the Soviet Union. Who cares about who cares about a few thousand, what was its exact term? Something like irritated Muslims, or I mean, he never would have said that 3 years later, because then September 11th had happened and Al-Qaeda had come home to the United States. But at the time, in his arrogance, he said this. The United States, and I would say this, and it's I think an important point. The United States did not, quote unquote, create ISIS. The United States did not, quote, create Al-Qaeda. The United States did not, as some people used to say, quote, create Saddam Hussein. In many of their policies, they are very powerful. The United States is very powerful. It's the most powerful country in the world, economically and militarily. But it is not all powerful. And in their policies, they almost inevitably create unforeseen developments that grow out of them. So for a while, they were willing to ally with anybody in Afghanistan in order to destroy the progressive government and destroy the Soviet Union. That was their priority. Once that happened and the Soviet Union withdrew from Afghanistan, the U.S. completely walked away from Afghanistan. The same government stayed in place for another 3 years. And the country was torn apart. The country was in poverty. They cared nothing about the people. But out of that grew the Al-Qaeda organization. The U.S. intervention opened the way for it. The U.S. invasion and occupation of Iraq, and that's what I'm trying to stress, opened the way for the development of the situation that we see today. But it was not what they planned for. And I think that's a difference that, it's easier to go to the conspiracy theory and say, well, the United States planned all this and, they had it all laid out ahead of time and this is what they were shooting for. I don't think so. I don't think I think they were shocked by the invasion, the ISIS invasion into Iraq, that they take over the Mosul Dam, and Mosul, the second largest city in Iraq, after trillions of dollars being spent and incredible amounts of bloodshed. Most on the Iraqi side, but thousands of U.S. soldiers dead, hundreds of thousands of U.S. soldiers suffering long-term injury, costs that will go on for decades from this. That they would do that and then lose a large part of Iraq to this movement. I don't think that is something that the U.S. can really willingly accept. But what do they do? And this has put them into a bit of a quandary. So just to go to some of the other points here, the Syrian sovereignty and the Syrian civil war. Obama's speech is really an announcement of extreme violations of both U.S. and international law. I mean, that's one way of putting it. The Constitution of the United States actually says Congress has to declare war. Obama says, no, I don't even have to talk to Congress about war, about it if I don't want to. And the Congress will probably go along with that. They've been going along with it for a long time. There's been no declaration, there have been many wars and no declaration of war since December 8th, 1941. So that's a violation, but also to say, we're going to bomb Syria. If we're going to be bombing Syria. We may be doing other operations inside Syria. Syria is a sovereign country. It has borders. There may be a struggle going on, a conflict inside. But we believe that what the U.S. would like to do, what they'd really like to do, is create another force on the ground in addition to their air forces and their special operations, which they're undoubtedly going to do now in Syria as well as in Iraq. They'd like to create a force that could both fight ISIS, could be the ground forces of this new effort, and at the same time grow into something that could be a subservient military on the ground to the United States and fight the Assad government and overthrow it. That's what they want to do. I think they're a very long way from being able to do that. I think they were very confident that they were overthrowing the Syrian government 2 years ago, 3 years ago, and they haven't succeeded. And it would take a while to train. They're talking about 3,000 or 6,000 troops. Those aren't very many. That's not very many troops. They would have to go for something much larger. One thing that I saw that was, just before this meeting, I thought was very interesting was an extremely friendly article about women fighters in the PKK. Now, I don't know if people know what the PKK is. It's the Workers' Party of Kurdistan. It's an organization, a Kurdish organization that's been based traditionally in Turkey, which is where the largest part of the Kurdish population in the world lives. That force came into, and according to all the accounts, they came into northern Iraq, into the Kurdish area of northern Iraq, and beat back ISIS. They were very accomplished fighters, but they're on a terrorism list of the United States. So the forces that can most effectively fight that they have on the ground right now are also on their terrorism list, which is a hint of the many contradictions that are going on in this situation. Almost mind-boggling contradictions, I think, and somewhat unprecedented. But, and it's true, the PKK has all-women units, including large all-women units, and they came in and the women as well as the men fought the ISIS and drove them back from being able to take Erbil, which is the Iraqi Kurdish capital. So they're looking at all these different options about, they have to get ground forces. They cannot do what they want to do simply on the base, they can cause a lot of destruction with their air force, and probably will be stepping that up. The point about isolating Iran is a very important point, I think. There's been a great reluctance on the part of the Obama administration. I don't think it's false. I think there was great reluctance on going back into Iraq after having staked so much of his political capital on the idea that I got us out of Iraq, which has never been completely true. But the idea of going back in. But now, based on the publicity around the beheadings of the Americans, they have served a purpose from the point of view of propaganda. The U.S. ally Saudi Arabia is beheading people, every week, and publicly beheading them. But that and many more people have been killed. Many Iraqis, many Syrians, many soldiers, many civilians have been killed. But all the focus here, not accidentally, has been on the two the two U.S. journalists. That served to change things and change the discussion. And now the Obama administration has the opportunity, and not just Obama himself, but the national security apparatus and leadership, to reassert their leadership in Iraq. And by so doing, that they're the major player now, again in Iraq. That's what they want to do. And by so being, to push Iran's influence back, which had developed quite a lot. So that's an element. There are people who are saying, well, is there an alliance between now the Syrian government, the Iranian government, Hezbollah, and the U.S.? I don't think that there is. I think that the reality is that in his speech, Obama made clear his hostility, ongoing hostility to the Syrian government and desire to overcome it and to overthrow it. The question about, and that's what they want to do. That has been their aim for a long time. On the day after the fall of Baghdad, April 10th, 2003, John Bolton, who was a top official in the U.S. State Department and a complete warmonger, he stepped out and said to the media, he was the Undersecretary for Arms Control, which is a funny title for John Bolton, but he stepped out and said, Iran, Syria, and North Korea should learn the lesson of Baghdad, of Iraq. And what is the lesson? Well, I mean, what is it? The lesson is really, if you look at it objectively, we'll destroy your infrastructure, we'll blockade you and starve you and deprive you of medicine for 13 years, and if you still don't know what we want, we'll invade you and occupy you and destroy your government and take over. I mean, talk about terrorist threats. You can't get a much bigger terrorist threat than that, but that's what he said. In December 2005, which is the last time I was there in Syria, it was very clear at that time there was a huge campaign going on based on the assassination of the Lebanese former Prime Minister Rafiq Hariri, to overturn the government in Syria, to blame Syria for it and to overturn them. So Syria has been a target and it continues to be a target, and that has not changed. How to convince people to get behind this? Well, I think we've seen some of that with the beheadings, which are horrific. I mean, the terrible things that this movement is doing, this organization is doing. But of course, the government and the corporate media, which really is so linked, so tied to the, we found the evidence back in the 1991 war against Iraq of how, as the war was starting, there was a big anti-war movement, that the White House called in the heads of the networks and the head of the national news departments of all the networks and said, we're going to war, we got a big anti-war movement out there, you have to help us deflate that movement. And they very willingly did. And so we had, and so they have together helped to create a shift in public opinion, at least momentarily public opinion, because that can all change very quickly in another direction. But I think it's clear that that's what they're doing. Is it an admission of the failures of the war? Yes, I mean, there's no question about that. That the wars in Afghanistan and the war in Iraq, which the U.S. leaders believed in both cases would be a kind of cakewalk, that this would be easy, it would be over soon. I remember, those of us who were organizing the massive anti-war demonstrations in 2002 and 2003 were saying, that's complete delusion. This is delusional thinking. I remember quoting the foreign minister of Syria at that time in an article who said, yes, the Americans can go into Baghdad, and then around every corner the knife will be waiting for them. And that was from Syria saying this, you should understand where you're going, what you're getting into. And anyone who looked at the history of Iraq, the history of modern Iraq, would know that from the day the British came in 1920 and established the colony, the rebellion was nonstop. I mean, the rebellions were in 1920 and 25 and 36 and 41 and 46 and 48 and 52 and 56, and finally in 58 they got rid of the king and the British. They kicked them out. But I don't know of any country that's had as many rebellions against foreign domination. So they did it, they failed in what they were trying to do, but they created incredible devastation in Iraq and in Afghanistan and in Syria now and in Libya. So we see this, a really, really highly destructive process. There's a book on our table written by a progressive British journalist named Dan Glazebrook that's called Divide and Ruin. Divide and Ruin. Saying that if they're not able, they're satisfied, if they can't take over altogether, they're satisfied with ruination of countries as long as they can continue to exploit the resources. They haven't been able to very successfully continue to exploit the resources. So it's a failure, but the failure for the people in those countries is much more devastating. So this has a great potential to expand, and that was a question, is a limited mission. Nobody knows. I mean, you know, no one knows where these things go once they get started. You know, I remember when Vietnam was developing, you know, first it was just advisors and then more advisors and more. And of course, when you get to 30,000 advisors, they're not, you know, they're in combat. And a lot of other things were going on. But when they sent the first big detachment of combat troops in 65, it was like, this will all be over in 6 months. No question, they can't, I mean, 100,000 US troops. And they got up to 550,000 US troops. And then the army started falling apart. But the momentum, it's not, no one knows really right now where this will go. Which is why it's very important to oppose where it's going already and to visibly. As far as relating to what's going on in the Ukraine right now. Right now the temperature has gone down somewhat in terms of the Ukraine, but the situation is not by any means resolved. I would just say, without going into a lot of detail about it, is that we have again a situation where the arrogance of the imperialist foreign policy makers is just impossible to overstate. Just impossible. And so what they did, if people remember, in the Ukraine, what was her name? Victoria Nuland, who was had just been elevated to Assistant Secretary of State for Eurasian Affairs, and the infamous Senator John McCain, showing up at demonstrations last winter in the Ukraine, and Nuland passing out cookies to demonstrators. I mean, imagine this in the United States, you know, like we're having a big mass demonstration and the representatives of Cuba show up, you know, encourage us to go all the way and overturn the government, which is what they were doing. They were demanding that the government step down. They were demanding, these are the U.S. people coming in. And more in the course of that, who emerged as the hammer for the opposition and who really brought down the government, even after they had reached, the day after they reached a compromise, were the fascists, the outright fascist forces, who are not a majority in Ukraine society, but have military training and military forces. And they drove the president out of the country. And then set up a new government in which these extreme right-wing and fascist forces dominated. And they announced the new government that the United States had picked. There was the famous taped phone call from a few weeks earlier where Victoria Nuland was talking to the U.S. ambassador to the Ukraine and said, oh, that one's no good, and that one's no good. We want Yats. And Yats was her nickname for Yatsenyuk, who was a banker, and she decided, you know, the U.S. had decided that he'd be the right person to be the new prime minister. So this was created, and as soon as he came in, he said, oh, everybody's going to hate me because we're going to have a terrible austerity program. And the standard of living for everybody's going to go way down. And so here you have the people in the Ukraine, a country that suffered millions of losses to Nazis, to fascists in World War II. And you have a new government in Kiev, and the new government is riddled with fascists and announcing that your standard of living is going to really go down a lot in order to be able to pay off the West, the loans to the West, because this guy is such a lackey of the West that he would actually come out and say this. And then you're thinking, are you really thinking in Washington, well, no one's going to rebel, are they, against this? No one would possibly object to these conditions. And of course, that is not what happened. Very quickly, there was rebellion in the eastern part of the Ukraine, in areas where there's more Russian speakers, but not just Russian speakers. And the breakaway of the Crimea, there was a referendum. Nobody really disputes that 95% of the people in Crimea voted to leave Ukraine and rejoin Russia, which it had been part of until 1955. And that other parts, key parts of the industrial Ukraine, called the Donbas region, around Lugansk and Donetsk, that people organized, and many of the people are veterans, you know, and have military experience, and organized military units and broke away. So what the U.S. obviously was going to do, wanted to do in the Ukraine, was, again, it's sort of like what they wanted to do with Iraq in the sense of, we'll get rid of, what you had before, because we're bringing you something bright and shiny and new as far as your system and your government, and you'll be really happy with it. And the people were not really happy, or many of the people in the country were not, and the country began splitting apart based on this. The U.S. also intended to bring the Ukraine into NATO and the European Union. This is an extremely aggressive step to take. Back in 1990, when Germany was going to reunite, when these counter-revolutions, we would call them, in Eastern Europe took place, one after another in very rapid succession, really based on what Gorbachev did, which was to break the alliance with them and surrender them as a peace offering to the imperialists who did not really, who were like, yeah, thanks a lot, now give us the rest. And what happened at that point was that there was a negotiation that took place over East Germany rejoining Germany and what that would mean in terms of NATO. And so the agreement was, okay, East Germany will be reunited and all of Germany will be in NATO, but there will be no further eastward advance of NATO. These were discussions at high level with leaders of the European Union and the US government, including Secretary of State Baker, who is George H.W. Bush's Secretary of State, making these assurances that in exchange for this deal, and of course that's how much you can trust them, right? But they gave assurances, and now if you look at NATO, NATO includes not only Germany, but Czechoslovakia, Poland, Hungary, the Baltic states, who have been extremely aggressive in wanting really a new war against Russia. And if they brought Ukraine in, they would be right at the border. They would be right at the border with the heartland of Russia, close to Moscow, close to what they call St. Petersburg now, and the real heartland of Russia. And Russia is not going to accept that. So you have this tremendous overreach, this arrogant overreach on the part of the U.S. and its allies, and doing things that neither a large part of the population in the Ukraine could possibly accept, or would possibly accept, and things that the government of Russia could not possibly accept. I mean, I think it's very interesting that one commentator on it, Stephen Cohen, who's not a revolutionary or radical or anything, who's a specialist on Russian affairs, he said if they did that, it would immediately, the nuclear arms race would resume, that Russia would move intermediate nuclear missiles and tactical battlefield missiles to the border. They would feel that they had no choice because in Russian military doctrine, like in Soviet military doctrine, you have to have a way of preventing being overrun. And if they're that close, and they can put their missiles that close, then the whole world would be put in an extremely dangerous situation. These are still the two powers which have the nuclear weapons sufficient probably together to wipe out life on Earth if they were fired. And so this is playing, the thing about this is that in a certain way they're playing at a whole different level than even what's been going on in the Middle East in terms of the great danger that would pose. But I think, again, we see the inherent expansionist character of imperialism. Like Lenin talked about a century ago, it remains the same. It has not really changed. And it leads it in directions that are extremely reckless and aggressive and really a threat to the world. So I think I'll stop at that point and see if we have more discussion.